We all have a story. Each of us carries a unique narrative of experiences, learnings, perspectives. They shape who we are. And as leaders, these personal narratives can be harnessed as tools for storytelling that can foster that sense of connection. It can encourage buy-in, boost engagement. Stories are free. They are easy. With some practice, you might need to show a little bit of vulnerability and quick. I mean, they can be very short. They don't have to be some long narrative. They can be used to inspire. They can feel emotional or entertaining. They connect ideas to people. They connect situations to the impact, and they can connect emotion to action. They help us make sense of things in ways nothing else can. So in this session, we're going to talk about things like what's happening in the brain, the psychological underpinnings of storytelling. We're going to look at what are the elements of storytelling, what are the things we need to think about when we're telling stories, and then somewhere along the way, a couple tips and tricks, do's and don'ts. So hang in there with me. All right, so I'm Jana Etienne. Just a little introduction. I am a CPA. I had a 20-plus-something year career in public accounting, and today I'm a certified diversity executive, shifting to this work about 10 years ago. I center on something called fearless inclusion, which I define as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. And I really wanted to share that today because in the work that I do, I help clients and participants and companies connect mindfulness and self-awareness. The goal is have an organization where inclusivity is the intention, belonging is the outcome, and a lot of the way we do that is through storytelling, and that's why this subject was I was so passionate about this. I have a couple quotes in here. I don't know if you read this book, Man's Search for Meaning. I highly recommend it. And the idea of meaning, I was actually listening to a podcast last week when I was cooking dinner. I don't remember if it was Hidden Brain or if it was Deeply Human, but I recommend both of those podcasts. They were talking about the difference between purpose and meaning. You know, they're so inextricably linked, but they are distinctly different concepts. And so that difference is actually relevant in our session today. Those unique mix of experiences and perspectives and things that we've learned along the way that shape who we are, when we look back at what we've accomplished in our lifetime, that is what gives our life meaning. Those are the things we've taken away that help us know what we've achieved. On the other hand, purpose is our guiding principle. Those are the things that we are looking for. Those are our goals. It's our primary aim. And for primary aim, this book comes to mind. I don't know if you've read it, but another book I highly recommend. And I wanted to share this because our why is so important. If we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, then essentially what we're focusing on is the what. I'll do these 10 things and then that thing will happen and we'll finish with this result. And now the power of stories is our ability to weave experience, emotion, and our wisdom together in a way that's relatable. They can be used as teaching tools, presentation tools, entertainment. I tell a lot of stories in my webinars because I've learned that, especially when we're talking about things like diversity, inclusion, self-awareness, mindfulness, authenticity, and so on, sharing and learning from other people's experiences are very, very powerful. In this book, there's a quote. In this quote, part of the quote that stands out for me is the part where it says, who believe your success requires the aid of others. That's the piece I'm talking about. Success requiring the aid of others. You know, organizations are powered by teams. Teams need a direction and a shared vision or a goal. And as a leader, that's your job. And leader doesn't mean you have the title. You can lead through influence. And that's why stories are important. Their intentions, though, when you think about, you know, your why, all of us have usually good intentions, but they're not always noble, they're not always good, and so connecting with your why is important. Otherwise, when you start telling stories, they're going to feel formulaic, and that might not, as a result, land the way you want. So what I want to do is I want to start with our very first polling question, and that is, are you comfortable sharing personal information at work? I really want to get a sense of how you all see this topic before we jump in. And I also want to remind you, I am going to try my best. You might see my eyes darting around here a little bit, and that's because on the back end, if you've ever done a webinar, it looks like a control panel for a pilot or something. Not that I'm a pilot. But I'm trying to keep an eye on the question queue. Please share your thoughts, your feedback, and questions. I'll try to take them as we go.
All right, Jenna, I just want to let everyone know, this is Beryl here. I've launched that polling question. We do leave each one open for about a minute. We're about halfway through this poll, so go ahead and get your answers in.
All right, somehow I didn't size my Q&A box properly.
Are you able to see the comments and questions that are coming in so far?
I can see them now.
Okay.
My workplace has a no drama policy, which means you're not free to share personal stuff. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
All right, I am going to go ahead and close down this poll in 3, 2, and 1. Let me share out the results. 60% are saying it depends on the situation.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I see 13% said rarely, 5% said never. It's really interesting because I think part of that has to do with what do we believe a story is. So,
Jenna, we have lost the presentation on our side. We cannot see the screen.
Sharing and start sharing again?
Yeah, let's try that and see what happens.
Show screen. Can you see that now?
We sure can.
And you're not looking at me, you're looking at the slides, right?
We're looking at the slides. We can
All
still
right.
see you, but you're not the focus now. We see the slides.
Yay, all right. So what is the story? And it was really interesting, that last comment. Essentially, it's a story where we are narrating or recounting an experience. I like to start whenever I'm talking about a topic with a definition. And this isn't a definition that's out of the dictionary, but I really like the way that describes it, because what we're doing is narrating an event, recounting an experience, and it's inviting those who are listening to it into the experience, which is very much how our brain processes things. We tell stories every day. So for example, we might use them to make a point. Think about a teacher that wants to teach the kids in the class the importance of perseverance, and she can define it and go through and give examples. Or maybe she tells the story of Thomas Edison and how he took him 1,000 tries to invent the light bulb. And so there's a story that illustrates the value of perseverance. You could use them to reinforce. We do that all the time. Think about a time in a meeting where somebody, maybe the managing partner or the CEO, was reminding everybody about the company's commitment to their customers by sharing stories of employees that went above and beyond. So we use stories all the time. And I think that when we talk about stories, even when I ask the question of stories, maybe what a story is might have influenced the way you thought about whether or not I share personal information and whether or not I use stories, because I'm actually going to ask about the stories itself later on. So what is in a story? I really like this visual because the elements of the story sort of build up and take you to the end point. So it starts at the very beginning, which is the premise. And that's the context for your story. It sets up the story. It helps the people listening understand why they should be listening to it. And it ties whatever this narrative is to a specific situation. And when you set the scene, you're creating a common ground for everybody. It's one thing to be doing this one-on-one, but if you're doing this in a meeting, or if you're doing it for a team, etc., you want to establish a reason why they should even be engaged. I mean, how many of us have been sitting in some meeting or something where somebody starts telling a story and you're sitting there thinking, like, why are we listening to this? What's the point? And so that's why this premise is so important. For example, you might say, you know, as we start working on this new project, I know we all understand the importance of teamwork and respect. This reminds me of a situation once when I ... So that's setting the context. Next, you have the platform, which is really about the time and the place. It helps define people. It helps people center around where the story starts, where or when it's taking place. So for example, you might say, you know, back in 2009, when I was doing XYZ for ABC, and then you sort of segue into the story. So now I know that it reminds me of a situation, and the situation happened a couple decades ago. And then there are the characters in the story. They can be anyone. So it could be you. You can be recounting a personal experience. You could be describing other people. You might be the main character, or somebody else can be the main character. You might be sharing something you observed, so it didn't happen to you. Or you could be sharing something that you saw someone else do. That's the thing about stories. Stories, they're not so clearly defined that only when you're doing X are you telling a story. And I think that that's where we don't think about storytelling, because almost anything can be a story when you start to just think about context, you know, tying into it other information than simply a push of data. Who likes that? Now, next after that is the plot. And think of the plot as the sequence of events or the actions that make up your story. A very good story usually has a start, a middle, and an end. And it features the characters that you talk about as they are navigating these challenges, going through these experiences, working through these problems. And, you know, earlier, I think it was Kimberly that talked about we have a no drama policy. Believe it or not, the more drama there is in a story, and I don't mean drama as in telling about my personal business and being melodramatic, if you will, but the more tension there is in the story, the more engaging it's actually likely to be. And then all of this leads us to the point of the story. And so in a professional context, in a meaningful way, this is where we create or tie in the key lesson or the takeaway. It's that central message. And here's the thing, you can say it explicitly. After you're done sharing, you know, this reminds me of the time when da 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 da, you can then say, the point of my story is, or you can wrap it up by trying to reinforce the reason or the significance of the story. So for example, you can say, you know, I shared this story because I just wanted to show how when we're all willing to ask that uncomfortable question, it will create a space where everybody feels safe to show up however they want without fear of being judged. So there are a lot of different elements that lead us up to the takeaway. And what's really important is, I want to reinforce this. It's okay to tell the story and then tell people the point of the story. You don't have to let people or ask people to assume. Now, I really like this, walk a mile in my shoes. And this is where stories are particularly powerful. As long as we have been humans, we have been sharing stories. I was thinking about this, about, you know, the discoveries, ancient times, and you see drawings on walls, and you realize that one of the ways humans have been communicating is that we've been communicating, a number of different ways since we've been around. It's how ancient tribes pass knowledge. It's how your grandparents taught you some, you know, lessons about the family. And one of the magical things about stories is they help us understand different perspectives. And they do this through the walk a mile in my shoes, because when I'm listening to someone else's story, particularly a leader's story, I get to learn from their experience. I get to see a perspective. Maybe I can understand how something landed, that same experience landed differently for you. And as leaders, it's really not the best way to lead to it to say, well, this is how we did it when I was trained. Perhaps sharing the story of, I learned it this way, and this is what I learned from it. This was my struggle with it, that kind of thing. And emotions, when we can convey them in stories or embed them in stories, they foster even deeper connections, because when we connect at an emotional level, that's where we start to get some of that stickiness. Actually, think of a story as a mental sticky note. And, you know, when I was preparing for this and practicing this, I started to pop into my head, and I invite all of you to do this, and I would say drop it in the Q&A. But I don't know that I'll get through it fast enough. But I started going back in my memory and thinking, what's a story that I've retained, that sticky note? And the first one that came to mind, I don't know if anybody knows the story, it's Anne Likes Red. That was the name of the story. It's one of the very first storybooks that I heard. And it's literally, it's for a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old. The book goes, Anne likes red, 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 red. A blue dress, Anne? No, a red dress. Anne likes red. So that's a story that I remember. So that stickiness is really important. And in fact, I think I have it on this slide. Yeah, right there at the bottom. 65 to 70% of retention is the retention rate for information conveyed through a story. And so that's why they're so powerful. When we can craft a story and create simplicity of something that's complex, it makes it more digestible, it makes it less overwhelming. Now, I saw a question in here. I want to hop in here. Oh, somebody says it's Dr. Seuss, Hop on Pop. I don't think I read that one. Somebody asked, if you're telling a war story and trying to stick to factual points, is it okay to embellish? Embellishment can be okay, but we have to be very careful. There's actually a do's and don'ts slide later on that talks about some of those being careful, because you don't want it to sound like you're boasting. So that's one of the challenges. Somebody said, it's illegal for the company to prevent you from sharing certain details, such as pay. It's a violation of labor laws. There are a lot of misconceptions about what's called personally identifiable information, as well as what you can and can't share. When I talk about storytelling, and I agree with you, thank you for sharing that, we need to be very mindful of what we're sharing, to whom and when and why, because we don't want to violate any rules. We don't want to reveal personal information. We don't want people to feel that they are being singled out. So thank you for bringing that up. All right, so back to the importance of stories. There's this little thing in our brain. It's this little almond-shaped structure in the back of our brain. It's tied to emotion, memories, and our response to threats, real or perceived. It's directly tied to bias. Now, bias is something that's normal in the brain. I know unconscious bias sometimes gets a negative rap, but it's something I call flying on autopilot. I actually did a webinar on this earlier this year. When something happens the first time, we attach feelings to it. Memories start to form. I think our strongest memory is a memory of smell, believe it or not. We then are actively processing that information, and over time we're laying her into it. Our brain sees it the first time, doesn't know it. But eventually over time, our brain gets to the point where it can process things for us automatically. I see something, I know something, and I don't have to really process that anymore. Think about driving to work and not having to remember the directions. Or you don't even remember the drive. That's something what I call flying on autopilot. Your brain, that is bias at work in your brain. What a story does is it interrupts that, and that's how it can interrupt the stereotyping that might happen. We might automatically process something, but the minute you start sharing it in a story, I'm following it along in a more conscious way. Using the driving example, it's like driving in a really bad storm. You might not pay attention to driving down this road most times, but when the storm is bad, all of a sudden you are very focused on how fast you're driving, how hard you should be hitting the brake, what other drivers are doing around you. So it really gets the idea of slowing things down, getting present, feeling what it's like just now, not just the data, but the emotion behind it. It opens up our mind. It makes us receptive to new information. It helps us understand, and we can often see things that we have in common. We're not focusing on our differences anymore. That is part of the power of a story. Now, how are stories told? I talked about the drawings on the wall. You can, body language is involved. If anybody's ever been to a ballet or a performance, there are no words, but there's a story being expressed. Body language, music can be a story. They can be real, they can be nonfiction or fiction. They can be something I'm sharing. I talked about this. They could, or talking about somebody else. And it could be a story of the future. That's an example of sharing a vision. I imagine, it gets me thinking about something in the future where I could see, and then I go off and I narrate a picture of what it is that I'm imagining something to be. So I spent a lot of time on this because understanding that context, understanding that the narrative creates this emotional connection. That emotional connection helps me correlate a lesson. It can remind me of an important message. It can reinforce a value or an idea. It can inspire, and what it can do, more importantly, is it can bridge us in ways that we are starting to understand each other's experience. And I can convey information that you are 65 to 70% more likely to retain. Now, what I like about this quote, I attended a presentation that Stephen did recently and got to learn more about his work. And when we were talking about storytelling, he said this, that you can't lead others differently than we lead ourselves. This goes back to my point about meaning and purpose. And that if you think about what it takes for you to move forward, your why, your process, your lessons learned, and the context of how your lessons might help others, might inform the situation, might inspire the idea, or might help people start to brainstorm a solution, this means you're taking your own leadership, brand, insight, and style into the story. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. There's something called brain synchronization. And this is where, when people are telling a story, verbal stories now, we are listening to language. There's a high process in our brain, in our neocortex, that processes our language. Its ability to do detailed analytical thought, the ability to actually speak, comes from that part of the brain. But there are lots of other parts of the brain, and when somebody is sharing a story, the parts of your brain light up that would that are involved in the story. So it's as if we are experiencing the same story, and so we pay better attention. We're less distracted. I probably didn't explain that as well as I could. Let me say it this way: we listen to the story as if we're reliving the experience. So an example: anybody ever gone to a scary movie and you get goosebumps? Your heart rate is elevating, or a sad story and you get to the point where you are feeling, you literally are feeling those emotional pangs, or in a success story where somebody is sharing something and you really get excited. This is how we connect at a more deep level. This is called neural coupling or mirroring, and this is where our brains process the story as if it is our own experience. That is then meaning I can take your story and I can then attribute some meaning into my experience. And then I can better understand how this then applies to whatever the takeaway is you want me to learn. So let me take a moment and look at some of the questions that are coming. I have found that stories are especially powerful during a job interview. Actually, that's a really good point, because it's a way of sharing what you know, how you learned it, how it applies, why you think it's important, and it gives people an idea of the way that you think. You see on the do's and don'ts slides, we have to be very careful of the stories that we share. We have to be careful that we aren't sharing oversharing information. It has to be appropriately contexted to the situation. But that's really a great suggestion. Thank you for that. Somebody says it also depends on your role in the company, in human resources, people operations, and do a lot of coaching. So it's very important for me to share personal stories that can help make a connection and show my human side. That's actually a really great way to say it, show my human side. This brain coupling, this neural coupling, the fact that when you are sharing, oh, let me go actually move to this next polling question, Beryl. Let's go ahead and open that one up while I share that neural coupling.
All right, that polling question is open.
So how often do you read stories in your day-to-day? There was actually the story that was just shared about during coaching. Now, neural coupling, where was the point that I wanted to make? I lost my point trying to make sure we got to the polling question. But let's see, there's another comment I'll read while the polling question is open. See, we have maybe 30 seconds here. Our no drama policy, haha, thank you, we're back to that. Our no drama policy prevents people from even asking each other what they did over the weekend. You can share stories if they're work related or could help people understand what they're trying to do. Keep that, but keep them short. Yes, quick, free, easy, appropriately context. Oversharing is never a good thing. You know, we talk about authenticity in the workplace. It's okay to be authentic, but it has to be work appropriate. It has to be work contextualized. All right, so I'm looking at the results here. You want to share them when you close the poll?
There we go. They're shared on screen for you.
So how often do you read stories? I see 46% sometimes, 23% regularly, 24% rarely. I'm going to be curious if, as we move forward and get to the end here, if you think about stories, what is a story? When do you use a story? What the story can help you do? If maybe you might say you would use them, weave them in more often. Human side is very important, yes. At the end of the day, it's how we each make each other feel, and it's not what we said that we remember. So storytelling and trust. Storytelling. That neurocoupling that I was talking about, it tricks our brain into believing that we are actually part of the narrative. This immersive nature of storytelling, this is what we call experiential processing. So we feel the story's events, we're not just hearing them. And what this does is there are a couple of different hormones that it releases. There's dopamine, which is the happiness, I think that's the love hormone, what they call it, the happy hormone, and then there's oxytocin, which is the love hormone. And when we experience feelings of pleasure or satisfaction, that's when the dopamine is released. It's when we start to feel happy. So that experiential processing can actually trigger this happiness feeling, releasing this dopamine, which then reinforces the behavior that you're trying to encourage or create awareness around in telling the story. And so stories, because they involve a degree of vulnerability on your part, sharing that. And remember, I know no personal information for some, but there's still vulnerability in sharing a story. Some people aren't comfortable with that kind of a narrative, but what that does, it's a way of telling people, this is my experience. We're signaling to them that we trust them with our own experience. And that vulnerability, especially as a leader, signals that it is safe for them to do that as well. Here at the bottom of the slide, you see psychological safety. And psychological safety is an environment where people feel okay saying they don't know, asking a question, expressing their ideas, sharing a thought, but they're not certain how it's going to be received. But what they do know is they're not going to be shamed. They're not going to be judged. People aren't going to say, wow, I don't know if this person, maybe not out loud, but not going to think you're less competent or less committed or less engaged because of the way what you're sharing. Psychological safety is that safe space. And as a leader, when you start to share a story and you're talking in a narrative fashion, so remember, a story is a narrative. It isn't going to be, on this day we did this thing and these are the facts and this is the data, but it's the context of all of that. You're sharing that same information, storytelling style. That is what's going to help signal to people that it's okay to share. And that's where you start to build that trust. Now, there's this book, and I don't know if you've read it. It's called The Trusted Advisor. I highly recommend it. I have a whole presentation that I do where we talk about what is trust and what does it mean at an organizational level and so on and so on. What I like about this book, and the reason I think this is universal, even though it's written in the context of building trust with clients as an advisor, which is what we are, accountants, whether public accounting, you work in the accounting department of a big company, we are advisors to our clients, to our businesses. And in order for them to trust the information we're giving, they have to trust us as people. And so that's why I really like this. It is a universal application because it's also true, in order for people to trust me as a leader, they're going to be able to trust all of these different elements of this trust equation. I really like the fact that this is put into a formula because, you know, accountants, we like formulas. So how does this work in the context of trust? Well, when you have credibility, reliability, and intimacy, and measure that against self-orientation, that's how you can build trust. So the first one is credibility. And credibility, you know, you're the partner, you're the CFO of an organization. That alone gives you a sense of credibility. I start off trusting you. And then through stories, for example, you now express and show a demeanor that tells me you have the experience, you have the background, you've done the thing, you've made the mistake, you've learned the hard lesson, you had the great win, the aha moment. Those things together strengthen your credibility as a leader, one key element of building trust. The next one is reliability. So do you show up the same way constantly? Trust can be fleeting, and it doesn't show up as expected all the time. It can drop, it can ebb, it can flow, and saying the wrong thing at the wrong time can undermine trust. And so that's why it's really important when we talk about reliability that people understand that when we say something, we do that thing. And we do that thing regularly. The expectations people start to develop of us, we fulfill them reliably. And when we are telling stories, we are reinforcing that and creating that sense of reliability, because this story, and then that story here, that story over there, we're giving people a holistic sense of who we are. That's what I mean by reliability. Strengthens trust. Then you have something called intimacy. And intimacy, let's not be confused by that word, because intimacy is about vulnerability. It's about being able to tap into my emotion. It's about being able to connect to the emotion of others, because the work we do can be intensely personal. There are feelings at work, and so that's why it's important to acknowledge those feelings. You know, when we're as accountants, even as auditors, I was joking with somebody this morning at breakfast. Somebody said, you know, auditors come in and tell people that they've made a mistake. And I'm like, no. The ideal audit is you walk in, you check everything, it's fine, and you sort of walk back out. So the idea of an auditor is, what we don't want to have is a major mistake, but when that happens, there can be a lot of emotions tied up into this, and those are the emotions that we're talking about. So intimacy, when we start to share stories, it can share that I've been there, done that, I know what that feels like. But we don't have to say, I know what that feels like. I can share an experience where I felt that thing. Now, the other one here is self-orientation. And the self-orientation is, who do you care about more? Do you care about yourself more? High self-orientation? Or are you really thinking about your team's best interest, your client's best interest, your mentee's best interest? Because when you are, then that actually can strengthen trust. So real quickly, I'm going to show you this formula in action. When you are high in all of these things, high credibility, high reliability, high intimacy, and high self-orientation, you score 3. Low self-orientation, you score 30. And so what's really important here then is that when you can demonstrate all of these things and you reinforce them, you bring them to life through storytelling by bringing your experiences in there. Remember, context. It doesn't have to be I'm sharing personal experience. I can be sharing a story. I can be sharing history. I can be sharing a vision. Storytelling doesn't have to be telling you about my life when I was growing up and the bad thing that I did. So that's really important. Empathy. Well, at this point, I think so much of what I've been saying already, if you haven't gotten there, tells us that the importance of storytelling and empathy, because when I can see myself in the story, when I can listen to your story and understand your aha moment, I can start to remember, yeah, we did have that problem with that last client. And I can start to remember what that feels like. When you're sharing that reminder, I can remember what it felt like for me in that engagement with that client. And then I can also remember that, you know, we figured it out. We knocked it out of the park. And so all of those feelings, seeing myself in the story, well, when stories are a little bit more personal, or when stories do speak to struggle or challenges, I can start to relate to those in different ways. I can be open to different viewpoints and activating emotion. And I wrote in here the word tenderness. And the reason I put tenderness here in particular is because when I think of tenderness and when I think of stories, what we're talking about is creating a sense of compassion, warmth, acceptance. What they do is they remind us at our core that we all, at the end of the day, we're human. We can make mistakes. We all experience similar emotions. What activates those emotions are different, but I know what that feels like, and expressing it. You know, when somebody says, I know exactly what that feels like, it can come off wrong. It can be rolling of the eyes, I know what that feels like, or, oh, I really know what that feels like. And so sometimes it's easier to express that by not saying it explicitly, but by talking about an experience that you might have had that activated that same emotion for you. And again, because it's come up in the Q&A, it doesn't have to be a personal story about personal experiences. If you haven't seen this video by Brene Brown, it's a great video where she talks about it's an animated video. There's a bear and I think it's a deer and I don't know, another animal. They talk about the elements of empathy. And that's seeing things the way somebody else sees it, storytelling. You're seeing my experience. Understanding then my experience because you're understanding the feelings of somebody else. I'm not judging, maybe I'm curious. I'm now starting to tap into what it felt like for me. And when you're storytelling in particular, you're communicating that. And here's the thing about storytelling, especially when I'm recounting a difficult situation or a challenge that we might have experienced as an organization, a big, you know, oopsie in the organization that we are now working as an organization to get past. I don't want pity. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. This is why empathy is important, because empathy is about understanding another perspective and appreciating that and extending some grace with the, you know, tenderness as I talked about. All right, so how can you then tell stories as a leader? Well, this quote says it all. I love this quote. The purpose of being a storyteller is not to say, this is what I want you to think. Because even if you say, the point of the story is X, I'm not prescribing for you what to think. I'm inviting you to reflect on that. If the point of the story is to remind us that it's important okay, I'm being technical now. It's important that we're on time so our clients appreciate that we respect their time. I'm not telling you, well, that's probably not the best example. If the purpose of the story, if they say the point of the story is to remind us that when all of us are open and willing to share their ideas in a way that's safe and we listen to each other, we can really be more creative and innovative. I'm inviting you to now think about what that looks like. And so telling a story, remember, isn't to push a narrative on somebody else. It's to understand how the narrative applies to a situation. Now, somebody said here, I want to make sure I'm reading this. As an auditor, it's been very useful to include stories to convey a particular way. A control is important. Actually, that's a really good way. Technical information conveyed in a story is so much easier to relate to. You know, accountants, we're very right brain, and we can talk to each other right brain to right brain. That's okay. But sometimes, I don't know if you've ever talked to a client and they just look at you glassy-eyed. The context of the story and how that principle applies, that is storytelling that is very powerful because it creates a connection to the information that doesn't require that I know the formulas behind it. So how can you use storytelling in your organization or in your role day to day? So remember, I talked about it being the art of that personal experience. You don't have to share a personal experience per se, firsthand experience. What you're sharing, though, is what you might have learned, some insights you gained as a result of an experience. So if you can't share that actual experience, tapping into something that happened to you, thinking about the aha moment that you had and what activated the aha moment, then sharing a story that brings that aha moment to life and that illustrates the aha moment is a way that you can bring that in and invite whoever's listening to your story to think in the same way. And so that's what's important here. I actually have another polling question. I want to go ahead and launch this question. When do you share stories? Because that's what this whole section is about as leaders. And I keep talking about this in the context of leaders, but leadership doesn't just mean a title. You can lead by influence and set an example. So let's see, somebody said, great quote, great book. I don't know what book that was, but thank you. Maybe that was Start With Why. Somebody said here, I'll share this. I think I can see there's a little bit of time. Beryl, tell me when we have to close the poll, if you don't mind. I'm looking at the Q&A.
Will do.
Regarding the participant who cannot share anything personal at work, wouldn't that reduce those employees to robots? Oh, I hope I've addressed that in that I can take a personal experience and share a story around that learning without having to tell you about my experience itself. How would you be able to build trust in that environment? I do think that there can be a concern that if we explicitly say you can't share personal information, some of us might get tripped up about then how do we share? And so hopefully I've given you some ideas now. I don't have to share when I fell down on the bike, but I can share what it feels like to fall down and why it's important to get back up again.
Janelle, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll first, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And let's go ahead and share out those results.
Share stories. So 36% said intuitively, 46% said only when relevant, and 5% said only when planned. So when planned, I am going to jump very quick.
Janelle, if you can do a stop share and start share again, it looks like we got stuck on the poll question.
Stop share, show screen. We back?
We are back now.
I'm all leaning into the camera. Sorry, that's probably not the best look. All right, I wanted to jump to this slide here, the do's and the don'ts. It's pretty high level. I don't really need to spend a lot of time here, but I wanted to jump here because of that last comment and something that's come up before. Business context is important. You might not be able to talk about a personal experience, but you can talk about why it's important. So for example, one of the stories that I often share in some of my sessions is around, vulnerability. It's around being authentic. It's around psychological safety. And I share a story about after I lost my mom. I don't know why I'm sharing the story now because I'm going to get emotional. I'm going to try not to. After I lost my mom, and it took a while for me to get back to myself, if you will, at work. And my colleagues, they had my back. And I remember one time I started to break down in the office. Gotta do this. Every time I should stop sharing the story. And she pulled me into her office. She sat me down in one of the chairs in her office, and she just kind of went back to work, and she created that safe space for me. That was very powerful. I never forgot that. And if I can't share that personal experience, what I can do is tap into that experience and talk about then how creating a safe space made me feel. So understanding the impact of a safe space without recounting the story is one of the ways to provide some context or background. Emotionless stories, they're going to sound like you're just reading a script or you're just saying something because you have to say the thing. Oversharing, that can get very uncomfortable for everybody, which is why even if you're comfortable sharing personal information, read the room. And you don't want to share to the point that people are squirming in their seats, rolling their eyes, or just uncomfortable. Embellishing, we talked about that earlier. The story is what it is. You can just tell it the way it is. You can add details to help it become more clear, but you don't want to make stuff up. You definitely, especially if you're sharing a lesson learned, you don't want to make it sound like, aha, and this is what I did and I'm so great. Remember, this is to help other people narrate their way through the story to get to the takeaway, to understand the key idea, to get a sense of how this thing applies to that result that we're trying to achieve. And then lack of meaning. There's no point of telling the story if there's no meaning to the story. That is the context, and you need to be aware of that context before you decide to share the story. I see that 36% of people said they share them intuitively and they share them spontaneously. And we just want to be thoughtful that when we share those stories, that we're always contextualizing them back to the business, back to the challenge, back to whatever it is that relates to your work day to day. Otherwise, it's just you and me having coffee. That kind of storytelling, that is not what I'm talking about here. All right, I jumped past a slide. I want to go back to these characteristics of telling a story. So if you want to tell stories, there are a couple things you want to do and how to craft a story. So first, speaking specifically to the concern. When you understand a worry, you can identify something that is a motivation, you can activate a curiosity, you can create a narrative that speaks to that thing, that people can emotionally connect to that thing, that people can reflectively bring their own experiences into that thing. And so that should be specific to the audience. You're going to tell a different story to, say, a group of interns than you are going to say to a presentation to the partners if you're in a CPA firm. Next is you want to look at the broader context. So why these things are taking place. It helps understand the rationale, say, behind the decisions and the stories that you're telling. You can make it more relatable that way. You can make it more understandable that way. That's part of the context. It's personal, which means I'm not sharing personal details, but I'm providing a human element to the story. I might throw in a personal anecdote. What I want to do is make it relatable. I'm trying to help by sharing a story for people to see things through my eyes, from my experience. That is where we activate that neural coupling, if you will, that mirroring response. That creates that emotional connection. You want to make it practical. You need to give practical, actionable steps that either tell people the point of the story is X, which can help us do whatever it is we're working on. Or what you want to do is invite them to then learn from the story and make it their own and apply it how they see fit, because I'm understanding the takeaway. And above all else, it has to be authentic. That is fundamental to building trust, because you can't fake authenticity. You can't. And if you want to share somebody else's story, it's okay to tell people that you're sharing somebody else's story, that you saw this, you heard this. You could even say, I heard a story once, and now you're recounting the story that you heard. If you've heard nothing else, I'm saying story a lot in the session around storytelling. If you've heard nothing else, know that all I'm talking about is creating a narrative around what you want to say to help people understand that experience and make an emotional connection for them to appreciate it as if they were in that story, whatever it is, because that is where you get that boosted retention rate, 65 to 70%. That is what creates that, that mental sticky note. Here's a whole list of places where stories can help. So brainstorming, that reminds me about the time I remember I had this idea around strategic planning. I can share a vision of what I think might happen if we can do X, Y, and Z, and in this order, because I had an experience where All of these are places you can share a story. In fact, everywhere that we engage and connect with people, there's the opportunity to contextualize things in the form of a story, in the form of a narrative. Anytime you can create a narrative, you will make something more memorable and relatable. Now, I created a second handout because this slide is really too small for you to see. And all you have to do is Google Steve Denning's storytelling catalog. This is a really helpful tool because you see something like, if you want to tell a story that is sparking action, reading along the top row, you need to tell a story that describes how a successful change was implemented in the past, but allows people to imagine how it might work in their situation. In telling the story, you will need to avoid excess detail that will take the audience mind off of their own challenge. You don't want to be prescriptive. And then the response to the story might be, what if, they start thinking, well, what if this, or just imagine that. So I think this is a really helpful tool to identify what stories you need when, and the things to keep in mind. And then the very last point, and then I'm going to jump in with these few minutes we have left into Q&A. This is true for us as individuals, one-on-one with teams, but this is true as an organization. Think about a brand story. Think about your story as an employee. Think about a customer story. Think about a product story. Stories are universal ways we convey information. That's why we work so hard at brands, because there is so much power in creating a narrative around it. So let me see if there are any more questions in the Q&A. It doesn't look like it. So after working at home and being isolated, oversharing, oh, thank you for sharing. Oversharing can be tempting when finally in person with other people. That is a really good point, something to keep in mind. It's interesting to see on the previous slide that sympathy includes passing judgment, when you can expand on that. So sympathy is about not passing judgment, because if you're sharing a story with somebody, or somebody's sharing a story with you and you find yourself judging them, then that means you are not connecting to the experience that they're having and feeling that emotion. That judgment is not expressing or having or displaying empathy. Somebody said, I worked at places, okay, glasses. I worked at places where I didn't feel comfortable sharing anything, but where I work now, we've grown up under similar circumstances, so we're all comfortable sharing, and has helped us understand each other better. That's fantastic, and I'm really happy to hear that because, well, I keep reinforcing this point because this keeps coming up, that we don't have to reveal personal information to share a story. Let's make sure that we understand that. Go back into Steve Denning's examples can help make it very clear for those of you that aren't used to telling stories, haven't often told stories. This, I don't even know why he calls it a catalog. This formula can help you understand the kinds of things to think about when creating a story or when identifying a story, and then how to deliver and narrate that story to evoke the response, to make the connection for people to apply the lesson to the situation. Because all of this isn't about sharing stories over Starbucks and coffee. This is about sharing a story to help move an organization, move a team, move a project, help develop, maybe you're giving performance feedback to help with growth and development.